Okay, so we're now ready to talk about the first piece of really significant reading, the first contributing body of philosophy to the conceptualization of human rights in the UN and to the drafting of the Declaration of Human Rights, as we saw in the last the last lecture. And so here we are with, there we go, Kant. As promised, I bet it was not easy reading. So there are a couple of things that make this a difficult piece of writing. One is that he starts throwing up some concepts toward the beginning that he doesn't really get around to clarifying until much later in the piece, and so it sort of leaves the reader taking on faith that all of this is going to make sense at some point, and it requires a certain amount of patience and diligence to get to the point where the different technical terms and concepts start to hang together in a way that the philosophy as a whole can make sense. And this is another thing that's difficult, is that it's very, very rich in technical vocabulary, which is tough. It makes it challenging. So, okay, anyway, let's get to it then, see if I can clarify a little bit what it is that is important about this for our understanding of human rights and where human rights come from. Okay, so first of all, Kant, he was born in 1724 in a German-speaking part of East Prussia in Kaliningrad, as you can see on the map there. And from the late 1780s to the early 1790s, he published the body of philosophy that really staked his name, which came in three texts. The Critique of Pure Reason, and the piece that we're reading today is kind of a setup for the Critique of Pure Reason, which he considers at greater length in that book. Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of Judgment. And these are his main contributions to epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, how we can know things, and to moral philosophy. It's the moral philosophy that concerns us here, because that's what the drafters of the Declaration of Human Rights picked up on, rather than his epistemological work. Not that the two can be strictly distinguished from one another, but for the purposes of understanding human rights, really the weight is far heavier on the side of his moral philosophy. Now, he makes a really important consequential move for the history of moral philosophy, and it's this move that is central to our understanding of human rights. He rejects the notion that morality is God-given, and we can see this in particular toward the end of this piece, where he explicitly rejects theistic or theological groundings for morality. Instead, he insists that morality is something that we give ourselves. In a phrase, humanity gives itself its morality. Now, he thinks that this doesn't happen just any old way we choose. It happens through a specific process, and that's what we're going to spend the body of the lecture looking at. So we can also, just right off the bat, flag a few phrases from the Declaration of Human Rights that we went over already, just so that we can start to see the inheritance that it has from Kant as we go through this piece. So in the preamble it says, whereas the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So inherent dignity, equal and inalienable rights, the idea of belonging to a human family, within the kingdom of reason, you could say, the notion of freedom, the notion of justice, and the notion of peace derived through the application of morality, specifically the categorical imperative, which we'll talk about shortly. All of these things are echoes of Kant. Next it says, whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in equal rights. So again, it comes back to these twin notions of dignity and equal rights. Now, we're going to discover that the reason that humans have dignity is connected to our ability to reason, to rationality, on the one side, and that the equality of rights is not equality in the sense that they're codified and asserted as force of law in the sense of the laws that any particular people come up with, or any particular community comes up with, but rather equality in that humans share the capacity for rationality, that again, we belong to that group of beings capable of reason. And that's where we derive this notion of equality from. Not that we're all the same. Clearly, humans are not the same. We're different from one another in every important respect, except Kant would say this one, and that is that we are capable of reason, and that his entire moral philosophy derives from this capacity for reason, and our dignity derives from that in turn. So again, these are pivotal concepts for human rights as the UN has conceived of them. Further then, we could consider Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, this is simply a bold assertion that it makes. Nowhere in the Declaration does it explain why we're free and equal in dignity and rights. It doesn't give you any sort of theoretical scaffolding that you can use to gain access to these concepts. But once we've looked at Kant, we can see where they're getting this. We can see that they indeed are positions, are claims that are supported by quite intricate argumentation. So then, the article goes on, they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, again, we'll see that this is also very close to Kant. Why? Because, first of all, the endowment with reason is absolutely crucial to Kant's philosophy. But the idea that we should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood, it's not simply obvious that we should behave toward one another in any particular way. That takes an argument. Kant provides that argument. Why? Because of the importance that he attaches to autonomy of the person and to the universalizability of the will and of the legislation of the will. All of these are concepts then that take some explanation. I promise I will get to that in a moment. And so when they appear in this form in the Declaration, they're given as kind of assertions or statement of fact without any argumentation. They're simply asserted. So what I want to get to here today then is to gain an understanding of where the argumentation that supports these assertions appears in Kant's work, so that it's, in my view, latent, that Kant's philosophy, that is latent within parts of the Declaration of Human Rights in really important ways, in foundational ways, that in a sense you wouldn't be able to arrive at these articulations of human rights without already having Kant's philosophy in place. In part, then, this is because Kant is responding in, again, definitive ways to questions that also preoccupy the drafters of the Declaration of Human Rights, like, what does it mean to be free? Why do humans have dignity? How must we treat one another? And above all, what is the highest principle of morality? And we can understand how he gets to these answers through sort of three general schemes. And I'll come back to these right at the very end as well. I'll work through them in order now, but I'll sort of bring them all back together in the end as well. And they are motivation, freedom, and imperatives. So first, motivation. Now for Kant, morality has nothing to do with consequences. And so we'll see a little bit when we read the work of John Stuart Mill, how utilitarianism appears in his work. We're not reading Mill's work called Utilitarianism. We're reading a different work because that's the one more relevant to human rights. But Kant is explicitly responding to utilitarians. So what is the sort of central hub of utilitarian philosophy? It's the idea that we understand good and evil in terms of what provides the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. That's the classic conceptualization. The greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number. So then, in that way of thinking, we get to morality and to moral judgment on the basis of the implications or the consequences of any act. So that it's not the act in itself that is good or bad, it's the product of that act. What does it do in the world to increase or diminish happiness or goodness? Later sort of revisitations of utilitarian philosophy under the name of consequentialism, hence the emphasis on consequences, frame it a little bit differently, and they look more at things like how to diminish harm or to avoid doing ill to oneself or to others, that is a more robust way of thinking about utilitarianism and morality. Either way, we arrive at it in the same way. We look at the consequences of an action in order to judge the morality of that action. Kant wants to do away with that. He thinks that is a wrong-headed approach. He thinks, rather, that the moral worth of an action depends on its motivation, on its goodwill. Now, goodwill is something that, as I say, he throws out there at the beginning of the piece, and it only really becomes clear by the end of the part that we read. So, goodwill, he thinks, is an end in itself. The motive that gives an action moral worth is duty, then acting out of reverence for the law. Again, the dynamics of duty and the law are things that are going to take further explanation because they turn out not to be quite as, say, flat as they seem right now. So it's not just that if you're obedient, then you're good. It's far more complicated than that. And part of that, the reason that it's more complicated is that it rests on the notion of giving ourselves our own laws. Again, that I'm flagging that for later. We'll get back to it. His second proposition about duty is this. He says, an action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose that is to be attained, but in the maxim according to which it is resolved upon, and thus it does not depend on the actuality of the object of action, but merely on the principle of willing, according to which, regardless of any object of the desiderative faculty, the action is done. Now, that is not a transparent statement, in part because it contains this technical term, a maxim. I'll give you a definition of that in just a moment. We could think of it as a subjective principle of action. I'll give you a fuller definition in just a moment. What in kernel he's trying to get at here is that the value or the worth, the moral worth of acting out of duty doesn't come from the end toward which that action is done. So then, if you're framing your duty in terms of something else, the outcome of doing that duty, then for him, you're not getting moral worth out of it. But let's turn first to the definition of maxim, because that will possibly help clarify what it is that he's driving at here. He says a maxim is the subjective principle of willing. The objective principle, the one that would also subjectively serve all rational beings as the practical principle of reason, had complete control of the desiderative faculty, is the practical law. Now, once again, he's taken something and put it in possibly the longest and most confusing way he possibly could. But we can think of it in these terms. So a maxim is a subjective principle of willing. It's the principle that I apply for myself to myself. Right? It's subjective in that sense. It has to do just with the individual considering what he or she will do. That subjective principle, the maxim, has an objective companion. So then one that is not open to alteration by any individual, but rather applies to all individuals. And that is the law. So you can think of maxim and law as comparable things at two different scales. One is at the subjective scale for the individual. The other is at the objective scale for all individuals. So they pair up in this way. So now if we go back, if we go back to the previous slide, hopefully that will be somewhat clear. So duty is an action. An action from duty has its moral worth, not in the purpose, not in the end, not in the objective to which it strives, but in the subjective principle according to which one decides to pursue it. So an inclination, by contrast, what you feel inclined to do is contingent, it's inconstant, it's self-interested, and therefore it's not, he says, a sound basis for morality. So what I think is best for me, based on my own self-interests, is not going to be best for everyone. That it's going to be down to my own particular desires and inclinations, and we don't all share desires and inclinations, so therefore it doesn't provide a solid basis for morality. Also, our desires are fickle. They change over time. So what I want now is not going to be what I want tomorrow or next year. And so hedging our morality in terms of our inclinations means that our morality also is going to be fickle and inconstant, constantly changing, constantly subject to whims. By contrast then, when I act out of duty, even against my own inclinations, or especially against my own inclinations, that's when I act morally in Kant's view. So that when I do something because I feel the sense that I ought to do it, whether I want to do it or not, and when I act out of that feeling of ought to do, that for Kant is a moral action. When I act and do something, even something that is my duty, but when I do it for the reason that I feel like doing it, that is, I desire to do it, and I therefore act out of my desire, that for Kant is not moral. It has to be something done out of the sense of duty. And this is, in a nutshell, this is what deontological philosophy is all about. Deontological philosophy is the kind of philosophy that Kant is doing. It stands opposed to utilitarian philosophy. It's not crucial that you understand or that you remember these two terms. I just want to give you that sketch so that in your future lives, when you hear a term like deontology, you'll go, oh yeah, Selby talked about that. That's all about Kant and acting out of duty. And then you'll feel very smug and be the hit of the cocktail party. Anyway, moving on. So the introduction of the notion of law in relation to maxims. So remember, objective in relation to the subjective principle of maxims, lets him define duty. He says duty is the necessity of an action from respect for the law. Now, again, law is still underdefined here. He's going to put a lot more flesh on the notion of law as we go along. So you need to, at this point, kind of accept what he's saying without having a full grasp of what it is that he's talking about when he says law. The important thing here is that we're getting a clear sense of the relationship of duty to law. That we act morally when we act out of a sense of duty, and duty is an action performed out of respect for the law. Okay, so in this first section then, we can see how Kant he's trying to set up a bunch of concepts and sort of lay some groundwork for morality by working out the relationships between goodwill, duty, and reason. Reason here found subjectively in maxims and objectively in law. The relationship between these things is the basis for everything that's going to come later, all of the really meaty stuff that is so influential for the Declaration of Human Rights. So the next concept, freedom. This is where we start to get into the stuff that is crucial conceptually for the Declaration. Okay, now it seems like a paradox, but in Kant's view, to act according to duty is to act freely. It seems paradoxical because it seems like if we're given a duty and we act only in relation to that duty, that we're somehow acting not as we desire, not as we would like, but we're acting on the strength of something that we're given to do. That doesn't sound like we're acting freely of our own will. He's going to go on to clarify this in a way that it shows that, in fact, acting according to duty is the only way that we can act freely. So then the determination of my will determines my freedom or its lack. So what it is that determines my will determines my freedom or lack of freedom. We can think of this along two lines. We can act autonomously. So when we're acting autonomously, we are acting under our own power, so to speak. Or we can be heteronomously determined. So hetero meaning other, So that when we're heteronomously determined, we are determined by something outside of ourselves. If we think of will and inclination then as two aspects of ourselves, then when I am acting according to inclination, my will, Kant thinks, is heteronomously determined. Why? Because my will is not determining itself, it's not autonomous. My will is under the sway, under the determining influence of my inclinations. And therefore, in that way, my will is not free. I'm not willing freely. Why? Because my will is not determining itself autonomously. It's being determined by something else. It's being determined by, say, my striving for happiness if I'm a utilitarian. And so these will be, anyway, these are the two streams of will that he wants to consider. One will have a moral quality to it, one will not. So heteronomous determination means that I act according to a law given to me. I'm not producing the law according to which I act, but rather I'm given the law according to which I act. So again, if we go back to things like my tastes, so I like chocolate. Now, for all those of us who like chocolate, that's not something that we chose. Rather, that's something that our inclinations have selected for us. Our tastes have chosen for us. Now, when we satisfy our desire for chocolate, we act according to an inclination that we did not choose, that we received in a sense, but was not of our own creation. In that moment, then, we're not acting autonomously, he says, or at least our will is not autonomous. It is under the influence, so to speak, of our inclinations. So then in that way, we can see heteronomous determination is opposed to autonomous determination for the will. Autonomy, on the other hand, means that I give myself the law that I follow. There are going to be constraints on how I can form the law that I give myself in Kant's view. That in one of the principal things is that whatever law I give myself to follow has to be one that I can follow consistently. So he goes into a lot of discussion about promising, for example. So that if I give myself a maxim, a subjective principle, a maxim, where I say I will give promises that I intend to keep only when it's convenient for me to keep them, then he shows that that leads to a contradiction within the concept of promising. And what follows from that is that then is not a law that I can give myself, because I can't will it to be a universal law. I'll come back to that phrase a little bit further along, because that's a crucial phrase for Kant. So then, the only way that I can get to a law that I give myself is through reason. So it's reason's being that will give me the universal law. And it's only by discovering the law that I follow through reason that I can start to arrive at this sort of autonomous principle for my will that gives me a moral foundation. So then, in turn, I'm only free when my will is determined autonomously. Right? If my will is determined heteronomously, I'm not acting freely. I'm acting under the sway or under the coercive power of whatever has given me my law. I'm free when I obey the law that I give myself. So here you can start to see then how the idea of duty is connected in Kant's view to the idea of freedom through the notion of autonomy. Right? So the source of the law that allows me autonomous will is reason. If reason determines my will, it allows me to escape the dictates of my inclinations or my desires and to assign myself law autonomously. So then we can see that freedom is connected to will, that will becomes free only when it is autonomous, and it achieves that autonomy through reason. So then, how is it? What is the mechanism that allows my reason to determine my will? This comes through commands or imperatives, as he calls them. So this is the third set of concepts then that we need. Once more, he divides imperatives into two types: categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. You can think of hypothetical just as a quick sketch as if something, then something else. That if-then structure is what characterizes hypotheticals. Categorical is going to be something else. I'll get to that now. So the hypothetical imperative is a form of command of reason. We could also call instrumental reason if we wanted to. It's defined by the ends it seeks. So it has that if-then structure. To achieve X, then do Y. So if you want to get a good grade, you should submit your papers on time. So it has this kind of instrumental relationship to achieving a particular end. If I want to stop being thirsty, I should drink my tea. Hopefully that's clear enough now. So the hypothetical imperative has this if-then structure. That, he thinks, can't provide a basis of morality because it tells us nothing about the motive or the content of one's actions, or of one's will for that matter. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, like goodwill, is good in itself. It doesn't appeal to anything outside of itself to establish its goodness. It is good in itself. There's no purpose that defines its goodness. So again, he's trying to distinguish his deontological approach to morality from the utilitarian one. The utilitarian philosophy would think of good as determined by the outcome of an action. He's saying, no, that according to the categorical imperative, it is good in itself without any reference to its purpose. This is where morality for him occurs. It's the location, the site of morality. Now, he, in just the pages of what we read today, which is something like 30 pages, he characterizes or defines the categorical imperative in probably 7 or 8 different ways. There are a few, though, that are particularly influential, that are kinds of the go-to explanations or definitions that you find in moral philosophy in discussions of Kant. So here they are. I ought never to proceed except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Okay, so let's start rephrasing that in a way that is more comprehensible. I ought, so first of all, ought, right? This is not a kind of mechanistic, practical, if I want this, then I should do this other thing. Ought has this moral quality to it, right? It's not appealing to the practicality or the mechanistic or the instrumental quality of my action. Rather, I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim, my subjective principle, should become a universal objective principle. So if my subjective principle determining my action is something that I can't will or wish or project as an objective principle, a universal law, then he's saying I'm not obeying the categorical imperative. This is why he has this idea of promising that he gives. That, again, if I propose what he calls a lying promise, then it might suit my inclinations at the moment, but it's not something that I can give as a universal objective principle for action that all people should follow everywhere. Why? Because it's not because if we did that, then we could never trust anyone, and that would be a bad state of affairs. So it doesn't have that kind of utilitarian quality to it, but rather he says that the logic of promising itself would become contradictory, and so the concept itself would fall apart. And that's why I can't take this maxim and make it a universal principle. And so if I can't do that, I'm not being the categorical imperative, and therefore I'm not willing in a moral way. His guiding question then is whether or not you can will that your subjective principle become an objective principle. Whether the principle that you are following in this moment to determine your action is a principle that all people at all times and places should also follow, or that you should follow in all future circumstances as well. If you can't, he says, then the principle falls apart because it can't function as a principle for the enactment of universal law. Okay, so then why is this an issue for human rights? Well, we could think that the whole thrust of human rights is that idea of universality, that it's trying to express universal principles that should apply to all people in all places and in all times. Again, not because the outcomes are better with that, but because it's aspiring to this kind of categorical imperative that Kant is describing. Now, he returns to the categorical imperative later on in the next chapter in order to explain that there is only a single categorical imperative, and that is, act only on that maxim, subjective principle, through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, objective principle. So he's rephrasing what he has just said. It's slightly tighter at this point, but hopefully it's becoming clear here. The idea that one's individual action has to be informed by a principle that you as an individual would will everybody to adopt at all times and all places. That if it's something that's only good for me right now, then it's not a categorical imperative. It has to do with my inclinations and not with my reasoning in a universal way, and therefore it's not even autonomous, it's heteronymous. Why? Because I'm allowing my inclinations to determine my action, not my will, and not my will in an autonomous way in particular. He reasons then that for a duty to have meaning and legislative authority, so legislative having to do with the law, right? Having legislative authority for our actions, it has to be expressed as a categorical imperative. The will, in turn, as, to quote him, a capacity to determine itself to action in conformity with the representation of certain laws, occurs only in rational beings. So then, to reverse that order, it's only rational beings who can determine the laws in such a way that they can act in conformity with them. It's that capacity to act in conformity with universal laws, the categorical imperatives. So then, we'll see this again right toward the end of his piece. He thinks then that humans are the only ones in a position to have morality in the first place because they're the only ones who are capable of giving themselves categorical imperatives and acting in conformity with these universal laws. For the moment, though, the crucial thing is that this is what self-determination is all about. Self-determination is about giving ourselves laws that we can will to be universal, that we arrive at through reason, and that's how we can determine that they should be universal. And so this self-determination through obedience is what gives us freedom then. So now he's managed, I think, to tie the bow, to show how it is that freedom and duty are absolutely intimately connected, that our autonomy, our self-determination, our freedom come only from our ability to give ourselves our own laws, to be self-legislators through the application of reason to determine if our action is one that comes from a will that we would wish all people in all places to follow. So if the subjective principle can be abstracted as an objective principle for all people, all actors. Now, because reasoning beings, he thinks humans are it, can self-legislate and self-determine in this way. Indeed, we can only self-determine because we can self-legislate. They're never simply a means to an end, but rather we're ends in ourselves. And so this is important because this is the third and possibly the most well-known statement of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Don't worry about this thing about Patton's translation. It's just we're working from a different translation. So what does he mean by that? Well, he means that he thinks that the world is made up of things and persons. So things are objects that can be substituted for one another, right? They have equivalents in the world. One mug can be replaced by another mug. And so we can treat these things as a means to an end, right? I want to have my tea. I need some kind of vessel to keep it in. This mug is it. Any other mug could serve just as well to do it. I can exchange one for the other, right? That these things are exchangeable, replaceable one with another. And that is why we can treat them as a means to an end. Now, he thinks humans are not like that. Humans cannot simply be traded one for another. And this has to do with our individual capacity for reason and autonomy, right? Our ability to self-determine and to self-legislate. That's what makes each of us irreplaceable one with another. So then, if we treat a human being as a means to an end, then we're not following a universal principle. Why? Or we're not following a categorical imperative. Why? Because that is not a principle that we could will everybody to adopt. If everybody treated everyone else as a means to an end, then the concept of humanity, of autonomy, of self-determination, these would all fall apart. So then we can treat people as a means to an end in a provisional way. My shower has a leak. I need to hire somebody to come in and fix it. So the plumber comes in. I'm treating the plumber as a means to an end when he or she comes in to fix the leak, the end being fixing the leak. So that is going to happen. That clearly is unavoidable. So the crucial part of his phrase here is never simply as a means. So then I have at the same time to honor or respect that individual, that plumber who comes to fix my shower, as an end in and of him or herself. And we can all think of times in our lives when someone has treated us as just a means to an end, as a stepping stone to get to something else. And it feels lousy. Why does it feel lousy? Well, Kant would say it's because under those circumstances, our autonomy, our individuality, as an individual reasoning human being, has not been respected. And that's what we find galling, because it violates the categorical imperative. So one... It's slightly a caricature of utilitarianism, but one of the sorts of caricatures that nonetheless is kind of powerful that deontologists use to criticize utilitarianism is to say, if you imagine that I walk into a hospital and in that hospital there's somebody going into heart failure, there's somebody going into kidney failure, there's somebody else who needs a new liver, then if the utilitarian calculation would say the needs of those three will be satisfied if my organs are harvested and given to those three people, and that means that three people benefit at the expense of only one. So the calculation is that the greater good is served by taking my organs, even though it means I'm going to die, and saving the lives of three other people. Well, then someone like Kant would say, then you're just treating Selby as a means to an end. You're not recognizing him as an end in himself, and you are therefore violating his autonomy by allowing him to die in the service of these other three people. So then this is why we come back to this phrasing of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And he includes this phrase, in your own person, as a way of arguing against suicide as well. Why? Because again, he says that would violate the categorical imperative. That taking life, even your own, when you no longer feel the inclination to go on living, is to be heteronymous, and that's therefore not a principle that you can will universally. Okay, so then in this way, morality is a question of beings subject to laws they give, but simultaneously these laws are universal. So we give the laws to ourselves, but because we use reason to arrive at the laws, the only ones that we arrive at are laws that everyone arrives at because reason drives us toward the same conclusions, and therefore they're universal in nature. So again, Kant calls the principle of the autonomy of will, this ability to arrive at your own laws, to be self-legislators. So the autonomy of the will, which in following the duty to act in accordance with the categorical imperative is freedom. So that when we act in accordance with the categorical imperative, using reason to self-legislate, that is when we are autonomous. That is when we are self-determining, because we are giving ourselves the law that we will follow. And that is why we only achieve freedom through this self-legislating, autonomous duty. So this set of relationships then, reason, duty, freedom, that's what gives humans their particular dignity. So dignity in Kant's view then, and this is the view that I think the Declaration picks up, dignity is not something that you achieve socially, right? It's not a social designation that this person has achieved dignity, this other person has not achieved dignity. Rather, dignity is something that humans have by this combination of reason, duty, and freedom that is universal. He says, reason thus refers every maxim, every subjective principle, every maxim of the will as universally legislating to every other will. So my will, following its subjective principle, legislating to every other will as an objective principle, universally legislating to every other will, and also to every action toward oneself, again, the reference to suicide. And it does so not for the sake of any other practical motivating ground or future advantage, so not utilitarian, but from the idea of the dignity of a rational being that obeys no law other than that which at the same time it itself gives. So this is the notion of dignity. I'm not beholden to any law, or rather my will is not beholden to any law except the law I give myself. And the law that I give myself has this universal objective quality to it. When I move from maxim to law, it has maxim to law, reason being the mediating function in both of those cases, right? That the law that I give myself is the universal law. And that is what provides my dignity. If I am laboring under laws that I have not given myself, but that have been given to me, then that is violating my dignity. And that is the case with everyone, right? So again, if I treat the plumber as a means to an end only, as an object then, as a thing, then I'm violating the plumber's dignity. Why? Because the plumber is also autonomous, free, self-legislating by his or her possession of reason. Now we come back to his initial notion about the unconditionally good will. He says, a will is absolutely good that cannot be evil, hence, whose maxim, if made a universal law, can never conflict with itself. This principle, and let me just pause on that. This notion of never conflict with itself, that is one of the hinges that he has for all of the law, all of the imperatives that he's trying to impress upon us, right? So that, again, this notion of lying promises are self-contradictory, and therefore they cannot provide a principle of universal law. So that's why, again, he's including that notion of principles that are not in conflict with themselves. So those are the only candidates for universal laws. Let me start again. A will is absolutely good that cannot be evil, hence whose maxim, if made a universal law, can never conflict with itself. The principle is therefore also the supreme law, is also its supreme law. Act always on the maxim, the universality of which, as a law, you can will at the same time. Now, I don't deny that that second sentence is a pretty ugly sentence, but he's saying the same thing that he said in previous conceptualizations of the categorical imperative. Only act on subjective principles that you could at the same time will to be objective, universal principles, law. So then we could sketch schematically the relationships between the two kinds of motives, the two kinds of freedom or determination of will, and the two kinds of imperatives on this scheme here, so that the ones in blue line up with each other. Duty, autonomy, and categorical imperatives line up with one another to give us self-determination and freedom, and therefore, through those, dignity. On the other hand, inclination, heteronomy, and hypothetical imperatives line up with each other to give us the opposites of those, or at least the ones that stand in opposition to those, so that we get lack of respect for dignity, using people as means to an end rather than respecting them as ends in themselves. We get the desecration of freedom. Why? Because we act heteronomously. We act under the influence, under the coercive power of some other law that is given to us rather than the law that we produce for ourselves through our reason. And so this sort of scheme is what sets up, I'm arguing, the ideas of dignity, freedom, and equality that we see in those opening sections of the Declaration of Human Rights. Now, we'll see next time a particular emphasis on the relationship between dignity and human rights that draws quite heavily on the Kantian view. And I'll give you a little bit more of Kant. I haven't assigned this as a reading, but he gives, in another book of his, he talks about his ideas of justice. I think that those are important concepts to have in hand when we start to think about the formulations of human rights. So I'll talk briefly about his ideas of justice. They tie in important ways with what we've seen here with the categorical imperative in particular, and connect in important ways to the notions of dignity that we'll see in Kateb's work as well. So until next class then.